we'll shift gears slightly here with David Wulff's presentation then on a grounded theory to examining atheism.
This is going to be more than a minor shift of gears. As a long-time proponent of qualitative methods, I'm going to sound like a very dissident voice. That is, I am taking essentially an anti-theoretical approach here. So, on the one hand, it may seem as I'm out of place, but as a celebration of the work of Bernard Spilka, it seems to me entirely in place, because Bernie, in his generosity, has always been a very strong supporter, has always been very affirmative about my work. Now, I might just mention that what I'm going to be talking about here today is part of a larger project in which I am trying to promote qualitative methods in the psychology of religion. Another face of this project will appear this afternoon when I talk about faith Q-sort, which I have been working on and seems to be showing some promise. Let me just say briefly that qualitative methodology is not marked just by the absence of numbers, but by certain fundamental propositions that effectively frame all current, or at least much of the current qualitative research. And that is, on the one hand, a rejection, not necessarily an opposition to, but a rejection of the hypothetical deductive method. So it abjures the starting with theory and the deduction of hypotheses. And then it also, at the heart of all of these endeavors is reflexivity, the continuing reflection throughout one's research endeavor on the choices one is making, the methods one chooses, the selection of participants, and so on, at every point reflecting on how one's choices are shaping the eventual outcome of one's study. I've chosen grounded theory as my general methodological framework, partly because I wanted at least to hook up to the general theme here of theory. Grounded theory, some of you probably know, starts without theory and intends to aim towards something that could be called theory, but working to be sure that that theory or conceptual framework emerges out of one's data, and that one doesn't start with that framework and in fact uses it as a Procrustean bed in which you force the data to fit. I have a strong commitment to grounded theory. I could have called this a narrative approach or a phenomenological approach, but I am trying to at least center this work in the fundamental question or questions that grounded theory addresses. When you approach a group of people whose experience are interested in, or whose views and so on. So the very broad question of, what's going on here? What problem are these participants facing, and how are they addressing this problem? So what I've chosen as the group of participants are persons who have become agnostics or atheists, and there is, as I'm sure many of you know, burgeoning literature on this. There's an enormous amount of material online at various sites. There's one called positiveatheism.com, but I find that the so-called Coming Out Godless project has a much more serious collection, lengthier collection of documents, all of which I have downloaded and worked through these narratives and have put together a kind of general schema of the elements, a kind of coding, if you wish. And I'd like to go through these, try to do this as quickly as possible. I've clustered these themes into 4 sets. One starts off with the background. So these are the common elements in these narratives. Parents' religious views characterized, one's own childhood religiosity, religious involvement described. Almost always there. Sometimes quite elaborately put forward, and of course presented from the current point of view of agnosticism or atheism. Sometimes, not so often, references to friends who shared one's original view, some sense of one's peer group. And in some of these narratives, not many, but conspicuous in a few, an initial effort to strengthen foundations that seem to be giving way in an effort to avert this process. Occasionally, in these narratives, someone will say they've never been a believer. They're really out of place. They don't belong on the site, but they want to talk about it anyway. So I include that in the analysis here. So the question is why? What sets this process into motion? What's at issue here? I've arranged these into 4 different sort of clusters of factors. Education, especially scientific education, or reading of books on science, often seen as contributing to it. Historical or logical pitfalls, so that this is more the kind of the intellectual side of it, but of course it's artificial to separate the cognitive from the affective, but it seems as if one can do it to some degree here, at least for presentation's sake. They will discuss the problem of finding evidence in support of, for the existence of God or existence of Jesus or the historical events of the Bible and so on. Theodicy, a major theme, and this has been noted, well, long time. Edward Spranger, many years ago, in his Psychology of Adolescence long chapter on religion, focused especially on the problem of theodicy and the struggle here with how do you account for suffering and evil. This problem arises in another section here more personally, but this is more the kind of impersonal. Look at the Holocaust. How could that have happened if there is a loving God? This is a more kind of current problem, pluralism, particularly with globalization, the confrontation almost day to day with other people's religious views and traditions. The problem is how to make sense of that. How does one cognitively find some solution to these conflicting claims? And then relativism, not so often seen in these narratives. Sort of the realization, if I had been born in another place, another time, I would be of a different religious tradition. And so, sort of, how can I feel so confident in my views when this is a background fact? Now, here we get into more affective material. Some of these items will overlap a bit, but they can be distinguished. So hypocrisy. Perceived hypocrisy of specific individuals, of particular organizations, the conduct of religious conservatives, and of course the terrorism and violence contributes to that. Sort of perceived moral, ethical shortcomings of religious persons and groups. The perception that if you're an insider of a religious person, you see within your cohort widespread rejection or condemnation to hell and so on of religious outsiders and being disturbed by that. And then revulsion over aspects of the Bible, belief in hell or God's killing of the innocent and so on. Those, for some individuals, are definitive factors that flip them finally over.